It began not with a bang, but with a sudden, deafening silence. On August 1st, 2025, Washington issued a tariff decree against Burkina Faso's most valuable natural export, Shea butter. The 50% tax landed without warning, without negotiation, and without a shred of ceremony. Yet its impact was like a thunderclap. For over 2 decades, Burkina Faso's Shea industry had sustained more than 160,000 women and fueled cosmetic empires across Europe and America. Now, without so much as a word, it was deemed unworthy. The message from the West was unmistakable: bend or break. But President Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-statesman, chose a third path. Within hours, he convened his trade council and addressed his nation, calling the tariff exactly what it was: economic warfare cloaked in policy. They tax our labor, our heritage, and the very hands that feed our women, he declared. The message spread through villages and ministries like wildfire. In the rural town of Bulsa, Amana Tata sat cross-legged on the red earth, her fingers thick with churned Shea paste, suddenly unsure if tomorrow would bring food or famine. Across the country, cooperatives ground to a halt. Warehouses locked their doors, and trucks carrying drums of unrefined butter stood idle under the brutal sun. What Washington saw as a calculated chess move, Traoré saw as a profound betrayal. He did not plead, he pivoted. In that pivot, a new chapter began. By turning east instead of west, Traoré invited a different future to the table, one not dictated by former colonizers or their currency games. What happened next would not only redraw trade maps, but redefine the very meaning of African independence. Could a single embargo, levied by a superpower, become the spark that ignites a continent's economic rebellion? Or would the sheer weight of retaliation crush a fragile nation still healing from centuries of silence? The old order watched and waited for Burkina Faso to fold. Instead, it stood defiant, and the world watched not with pity, but with questions. The impact of the tariff struck fast and deep. Across Burkina Faso, procurement offices went dark. Export managers made frantic calls to American distributors, but buyers in Missouri, Florida, and Texas had vanished from the phone lines. Some companies rerouted their orders to Ghana and Benin, while others froze entirely, unwilling to risk further sanctions. In Bobo Dioulasso, the nation's main transport hub, truckloads of shea butter sat unmoved for days. Drivers slept in their cabs, paid by the journey, but with nowhere left to go. Within 48 hours, haulage volumes had fallen by 32%. Factories suspended procurement, and cooperative women stood beneath neem trees, waiting for instructions that never came. In Kaya, a cooperative leader named Salamata Konate gathered her team and spoke with restrained resolve. "They think we are just exporters," she said, "but we are mothers, we are fighters." Across the Atlantic, the silence was louder. No press conference from the White House, no explanation from trade officials, only vague statements citing national interest and economic realignment. But in the corridors of Washington, there was a clear calculation. The aim was pressure, disruption, and control. What they didn't calculate was Captain Traoré's readiness to pivot. On August the 2nd, he summoned regional agricultural unions to Ouagadougou and declared an emergency assistance program for local cooperatives. "They will not break us by starving our people," he said, his voice steady and uncompromising. The phrase traveled faster than Shea shipments ever had. In Nairobi and Mumbai, his defiance led the headlines. In Dubai and Dhaka, market analysts debated the repercussions. The London Shea Futures Index spiked by 11% as traders scrambled to hedge supply risk. In Lagos, exporters hesitated to sign deals, wary of becoming collateral in a new trade war. But this wasn't just about butter. It was about control, about who owns the first mile of a global supply chain and who reaps the final dollar. At the Ministry of Industry in Ouagadougou, Minister Sor Zerbo made it plain. This isn't supply disruption. This is a test of national backbone. That backbone would soon be tested further. In Illinois and Georgia, cosmetic labs began reformulating their products, replacing Burkina Faso's butter with Ghanaian stock and synthetic substitutes. But nothing matched the signature blend of creamy texture and high fatty acid balance. In Denver, a mid-tier beauty brand quietly admitted its new formula felt off. Customer complaints poured in. Creams no longer absorbed smoothly. Balms left a greasy film. Customer loyalty began to waver. Then came the deeper injury: identity loss. American consumers, increasingly obsessed with clean, ethical sourcing, noticed the change. Labels stopped listing origins. Reviews cried foul. "This isn't real Shea," they wrote. "Something's wrong." Across boutique beauty circles, a phrase began to circulate: losing the soul of the brand. Inside a natural skincare shop in Chicago, Clarissa Woodson stared at empty shelves and whispered, "3 months now, no Shea again." She was not alone. From Brooklyn to Los Angeles, store owners felt the same squeeze. Larger companies like Estée Lauder absorbed the hit with their scale, suspending certain product lines and cutting corners elsewhere. But small businesses suffered. Staff were laid off. Some storefronts closed. One skincare founder in Miami confessed she was taping shipping boxes by hand to save on costs. "Margins are gone," she said. "If rent spikes again, we're finished." Meanwhile, Traoré was not celebrating. Within the midnight walls of the presidential palace, he reviewed logistics corridors, prioritized road repairs, and instructed his transport ministry to open new routes toward the east. He wasn't playing catch-up. He was 3 moves ahead. At 10:17 a.m. on August 4th, the counterpunch landed. China's Ministry of Commerce issued official import licenses for 128 companies in Burkina Faso. The deal was clean: 5 years, no quotas, direct rail access, and priority refining rights. No handouts, no debt, just trade. Inside the National Palace, Traoré stood before a map of West Africa, his finger tracing the old American route, then sliding east until it stopped at the port of Guang'an. "This is no longer theory," he said. "This is our new axis." The statement rippled across ministries. What had begun as a defense now became a new direction. Shea butter, once a forgotten commodity, now sat at the center of a global realignment. In the hills of Kenadougou, women danced outside their cooperatives. "It means we work tomorrow," said Ayo, adjusting her headscarf. "And next week, and maybe next year." That same week, Chinese buyers arrived in Abidjan and Lomé to coordinate shipments. The Belt and Road Corridor flickered to life. Shea from a landlocked nation now flowed eastward, backed by policy, pride, and precision. Across African media, a new phrase emerged: Shea diplomacy. In those 2 words was the quiet suggestion that maybe, just maybe, Burkina Faso had shifted more than butter. Inside the steel and glass labs of Sinwar Biotech in Chengdu, stainless tanks gleamed under LED lights, each calibrated to refine shea butter. Not from Ghana, not from Benin, but from Burkina Faso. The transformation was swift. Just weeks earlier, China had only dabbled in this niche market. Now, it was positioning itself to dominate it. The moment Traoré signed the $2.1 billion agreement, Beijing responded not with slogans, but with tangible infrastructure. 3 processing facilities broke ground in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and Nanjing. Hundreds of jobs were promised. Supply chains were reoriented. For China, the pivot secured a new source of high-quality product. For Burkina Faso, it secured something far more valuable: sovereignty. No longer was shea butter shipped raw, only to be refined and sold back at a massive markup. The new deal embedded processing clauses, technology transfers, and reinvestment mandates into every line. Solar dryers, logistics grants, and factory training were not optional extras. They were signed obligations. For decades, African nations had exported their wealth for pennies, only to buy it back in luxury packaging for hundreds of dollars. Traoré called it economic servitude. His government changed that equation. In Ouagadougou, new cooperative programs taught export scheduling, inventory management, and international negotiation. Women who once cracked shea nuts barefoot now scanned shipping manifests and spoke basic Mandarin. Each refined ton carried a new national stamp, the emblem of women's gold. It was more than just branding, it was identity. In Accra and Lagos, radio hosts debated whether cocoa and palm oil could follow the Shea model. In Dar es Salaam, fashion shows displayed makeup lines sourced entirely from Shea for Sovereignty batches. And in Johannesburg, activist murals read, "From soil to sovereignty." Burkina Faso's pride had grown from protest to policy, from crisis to blueprint. It was not just an economic victory, it was a cultural one. Even the Ministry of Education responded. New curriculum modules on indigenous trade history were rolled out. One assignment asked, "What does sovereignty smell like?" A 12-year-old girl wrote, "It smells like the butter my grandmother makes." Meanwhile, in Washington, trade officials clung to a narrative of national security. They claimed the tariffs were defensive, designed to level the playing field. But behind closed doors, frustration brewed. Their move had backfired. Small American businesses had collapsed. Brand loyalty was eroding, and supply chains were frayed. And yet, Burkina Faso did not gloat. It governed. While Paris now bid for access, it once assumed by default, Burkina Faso negotiated like an equal. In Addis Ababa, diplomats reviewed a trade framework from Traoré. Not a plea, but a clear, bold, signed proposal. "We used to ask," one West African envoy whispered. "Now we negotiate." On runways in Seoul and on store shelves in Lagos, Shea butter from Burkina Faso now carried a different scent. Purpose. It was no longer a filler, it was a flag. Analysts at the African Development Bank described the shift as seismic. "They have gone from being exploited," one senior economist said, "to being irreplaceable." The Wall Street Journal ran a rare front-page story with the headline, "From Shea to Strategy, Africa's New Power Broker." Still, inside the National Cooperative in Ouagadougou, no parades were held. Instead, Traoré shared midnight sessions on corridor repairs, reviewed refinery timelines, and ensured every document matched the dignity he had promised. He hadn't just rewritten a deal, he had redrawn the map. The question now wasn't whether the pivot worked, it was how far it would reach. Would cocoa be next? Would other African nations dare to reimagine their exports not as donations to the global machine, but as sovereign tools of leverage? Could this doctrine of trade rooted in fairness, dignity, and vertical power stand against the might of old empires? And volatile markets? Inside boardrooms from Nairobi to New York, executives whispered the same word they once used dismissively: Burkina Faso. But this time, they said it with caution, with respect, with strategy. The world had expected silence. Traoré delivered alignment. And that shift, subtle but total, had turned a landlocked country into the keyholder of a new supply order. By mid-August 2025, Burkina Faso's economic pulse beat with new clarity. At the Yerba refinery, manager Idrissa Bakounou walked past crates marked for Guangdong. Each barrel was stamped with "Women's Gold." 2 weeks earlier, he had prepared to shut down. Now, he was onboarding 10 new workers, most of them single mothers. The shift from uncertainty to resurgence was not gradual. It was strategic. President Traoré had done more than just react. He had anticipated betrayal, mapped out alternatives, and executed a pivot rooted in dignity. His approach wasn't ideological, it was infrastructural. The Dori-Jibo corridor, long plagued by potholes and delays, became the spine of the new eastern route. Contracts signed with China included not only exports but joint ventures in refining and packaging. No longer would Burkina Faso export its identity for others to rebrand. It would refine, label, and distribute with sovereignty. The Ministry of Trade issued new export regulations mandating that all outbound Shea undergo value-added processing before departure. Foreign investors initially balked, but Chinese partners, sensing a long-term advantage, embraced it. 3 logistics hubs were established in Lao, Koudougou, and Banfora, reducing internal delays by 40%. For the first time, smallholder cooperatives had access to cold storage and digital invoicing. A decade ago, these women cracked nuts in the open air. Now, they were processing ingredients for Asian luxury brands and receiving payments within 72 hours. At a presentation to investors in Shanghai, Senior Biotech's procurement director held up a jar of cream and said, "This is not aid, this is strategy." That phrase reverberated beyond cosmetics. In Jakarta, officials from Indonesia's trade ministry met with Burkina Faso's delegation to discuss joint refining of palm derivatives. In Tokyo, DK Skincare signed a long-term sourcing deal that bypassed traditional European traders. In Seoul, K-beauty startups praised the quality and consistency of Burkina Faso's Shea, calling it the gold of the global south. Meanwhile, African governments were taking notes. Ghana's Ministry of Agriculture launched a working group on cocoa verticalization. Senegal began assessing the feasibility of local cashew oil refining. For decades, Western powers insisted Africa lacked the infrastructure to lead. Traoré dismantled that myth brick by brick. His model wasn't charity-based. It demanded contracts, clear terms, and respect. In one closed-door meeting with French trade envoys, Traoré reportedly stated, "We are no longer your reserves. We are your rivals." That tone echoed in business schools across Africa. Universities began teaching the Shea doctrine as part of their development economics syllabus. Students in Abidjan debated case studies on value chain control. In Accra, youth-led cooperatives rebranded their products with phrases like, "From Africa with authority." No continent had ever shifted a narrative so swiftly. No leader had ever made butter into a battleground. Within the cultural sphere, musicians released singles titled "Shea is Ours." Poets recited verses at independence festivals that compared cracked shea nuts to national scars that were now healing. In Dar es Salaam, murals showed women lifting barrels of butter toward rising suns. A continent that had once whispered for inclusion now sang of ascendancy. And yet, amidst the global fascination, Traoré remained grounded. He instructed ministries to audit every contract for loopholes and to localize legal counsel for trade enforcement. He banned the use of offshore arbitration in Shea disputes. Burkina Faso would not outsource its justice. In every clause, he placed the worker first. Cooperatives were guaranteed royalties from every exported unit. A global first. This was not just policy. It was protection. It was respect for hands long unseen. Even in global forums, the shift was visible. At the UN Economic Commission for Africa, Burkina Faso tabled a motion to classify Shea under strategic soft commodities. The vote passed with support from 15 nations. At the African Union, leaders quoted Traoré's speech, "When we control the first mile and the last word, we control the story." For the cosmetic giants of the West, the loss was more than logistical. It was symbolic. Their grip had slipped. Consumers questioned the authenticity of reformulated creams. Bloggers exposed substitutions and greenwashing, and once loyal customers turned to products that bore traceable, ethical roots. Some brands tried to re-enter Burkina Faso. They sent envoys, wrote op-eds, and issued statements of regret, but they no longer set the terms. In Ouagadougou, a young exporter smiled as he rejected an offer from a major American label. "We don't chase contracts anymore," he said. "They come to us." That phrase became a poster in the National Business School. It encapsulated a decade of frustration now reborn as leverage. Traoré had not only shielded an industry, he had weaponized it into policy, culture, and pride. And in that transformation, Burkina Faso's butter ceased to be a commodity. It became a message, a mirror, and a map. What does sovereignty look like when it is built not on speeches but on schedules, not on slogans, but on shipping manifests? In Burkina Faso, it looked like women waking before dawn, cracking nuts not for pennies, but for purpose. It looked like a leader who refused to apologize for strategy, who negotiated not out of desperation, but design. It looked like trade agreements with clauses for dignity, enforcement for justice, and royalties for the women who stirred the pace that built an industry. In global halls once deaf to African voices, the murmur grew louder. Was this just one contract or the unveiling of a doctrine? Could a raw material, long overlooked and undervalued, become the pivot point of a global supply chain? When did butter stop being just butter and become a sovereign symbol for the women of Bobo Dioulasso? The answer wasn't theoretical. It was weekly pay arriving on time, invoices no longer disputed, and foreign buyers showing up not with demands, but with respect. In Paris, New York, and Tokyo, consumers noticed too. The texture returned, the scent lingered. But most importantly, the story changed. No longer was Shea packaged as an exotic extract from somewhere unknown. It now came with names, faces, and a flag. The global beauty market, once built on invisibility, now confronted its own reflection. Could a continent once silenced it now lead? Could its smallest farmers now set the terms? Across Africa, the questions multiplied. If Burkina Faso could do it with Shea, what stopped others from doing the same with coffee, with cotton, with gold? What new future could rise if raw no longer meant weak? If production began not in ports, but in pride? And if women's hands were no longer last in line, but first in command? The answers are still unfolding, but one truth remains. What began with a tariff ended with a tremor, and in that tremor, the old world cracked, just enough for something new to grow. So ask yourself, when did Africa stop being a supply and start becoming a source of power? When did the continent's silence break loud enough for trade ministers in Paris, Beijing, and Washington to pause mid-sentence? In Burkina Faso, the answer wasn't found in rallies or protests. It was in a recalibrated export slip, in a renegotiated contract, and in the resolute voice of a captain who stood before a map and redrew the axis. The world had long written Africa as a footnote in trade, but Traoré wrote it into the headline, not by demanding favors, but by structuring fairness, not by closing borders, but by opening lanes under African control. What changed the rules wasn't rebellion, it was readiness. And what made that readiness unstoppable was the belief that dignity doesn't come from permission. It comes from preparation. From a field worker knowing her export price, from a contract translated in her language, from a government that puts value before volume and people before praise. The Shea deal with China was not the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a framework, a vision in which raw no longer means cheap, and a path where being landlocked doesn't mean being locked out. And in this framework, Africa no longer circles the same old tables. It builds new ones. So if you've ever seen your labor devalued, your history distorted, or your future negotiated without you, ask what it means to rewrite the rules. Comment below with your thoughts. What does sovereignty mean in your language? If you've walked these streets, built something from nothing, or simply watched your people rise in silence, drop your voice here. And if you stand with this vision of Africa, strategic, sovereign, and unshakable, share this story. Share it with someone who still believes we must beg to be included. Share it with someone who forgot how power shifts. And above all, subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the idea that dignity is no longer delayed. It is delivered, and it begins not tomorrow, but now.